Ladies and gentlemen, you read that title right, because in my hands is the brand new Ryzen 7 9800X3D, and today we're going to build the absolute fastest gaming PC you can in 2024. I've been excited about this for ages, and obviously this has been a bit of a year of CPU disappointments. We've had release after release, but nothing has actually beaten what came before it. And surely, this can't be worse than the old fastest gaming CPUs. This has to be better. So throughout this video, we've grabbed an RTX 4090, and we're going to be building this pretty epic little gaming PC. But don't worry, we're going to give you those all-important gameplay benchmark numbers at the end of the video, so you can actually see exactly how this performs in the latest and greatest games, and we'll be showing you how this performs against every other CPU. Well, not ever, but certainly quite a lot of them. It's going to be a really exciting video, and I can't wait to bring you along for the ride right after a short word from this video sponsor. MSI's new Core Liquid I series have arrived, bringing awesome all-in-one cooling to the masses. Thanks to the pre-installed fans, just 2 cables to connect for the radiator block, and a uni bracket for both AMD and Intel, installation is a breeze. The cooler looks awesome too, with its eye-catching dual-sided infinity mirror and RGB fans glowing up your rig, in addition to the awesome CPU cooling performance. Learn more about this incredible all-in-one today with a link down below. Rightio then everyone, I think it is time to get this show on the road, and a couple of things really to note. The first one obviously being that this is hopefully going to be the absolute fastest gaming CPU. We're filming this a week before launch, but the way we're going to do this is to make sure by the time you see this, everything's up to date. So we'll discover how good this is throughout the video, and then as I say, Carl will actually give you all of those proper benchmark numbers from weeks of testing, so you will know how this compares. But there's a few things actually that have changed this time around. The main one really being that the 3D V-cache is now actually underneath the CCD chiplets rather than before it was on top, and essentially this should give you better clock speeds. You can now actually overclock this, and there's also going to be a new mode in the BIOSes as well that are going to be called different things. I think on this it's called Turbo Game Mode, that should actually give you like a one-click, even better gaming performance than you did before. But essentially this is almost certainly going to be the absolute best of the best. If it can do around about 8 to 10% average frame rates improvements, I'm going to be a happy boy. I mean, let's be honest, the bar's not exactly been set all that high by Intel Core Ultra's negative improvements. Of course, it is absolutely worth noting that you don't actually need a new motherboard like this one if you were coming from an older generation AM5 board. So if you've already upgraded to B650E, maybe you've got like a Ryzen 7700 or even the older X3D chip, then you can use that motherboard. Make sure you obviously update the BIOS and then carry it forward. But if you are going to sort of be building from scratch, you might be interested in one of the new X870 or X870E motherboards. This one is the Crosshair Hero from Asus ROG, and you know, it's not going to be for everyone, let's be honest. This is definitely a very overbuilt motherboard. It's going to be great for overclocking. It's got loads of platform features, extra PCI Generation 5. You've got 2 USB 4s on this. As we give this a spin round so you can see this properly though, I will shout out the fact that you do actually get 2 USB 3s on this motherboard, which is going to be very useful if you're going for a high-end case, because actually most motherboards don't have this. So this is definitely a good feature, alongside things like the very large VRMs. You've got a large heatsink for your PCI Gen 5. Not that PCI Gen 5 is exactly necessary at the moment, but certainly very future-proof. Good heatsink here, and then I imagine if you take these off, you'll find that you do have an additional 4 M.2 slots. These 2 are Generation 5 alongside this top one, and then these 2 are Gen 4. But I think the first thing to do is going to be to properly christen this motherboard with a brand new CPU. And I will be honest to say that if you're expecting something crazy different about this, you are going to be very disappointed in terms of aesthetics and the way it looks, because if you took that text off, you would never know this was any different to any of the others. But I mean, let's be honest, that's pretty standard for a CPU, and it's quite literally by design. So we'll drop this down into position, and then lower it down, and click it into position. Save that for Ron. Yes, I've made that joke loads of times before, but get over it. It was still funny, wasn't it? And then rather interestingly, something that is a little bit different this time around is that AMD have actually provided me with an SSD, and they said,
"You probably won't need it, but in case you do, here it is."
Which leads me to think that there are probably some incompatibility issues somewhere within Windows, but to be fair to AMD, this exact same thing happened with Intel Core Ultra, so I think this is probably more a Microsoft thing, but we'll reserve judgment, shall we? And I must admit that usually when someone sends me something like this, I'm always a little bit suspicious and I almost deliberately don't use it. But I think in this particular instance, it does make sense because, to be honest, I probably would use a 990 anyway, and I always have a copy of Windows preloaded on my SSDs anyway, and because I had so me issues with Core Ultra. I just want this to work. Oh, PC Centric, no, you're cheating. AMD have got some funny code that they've put on that, and it's not fair.
That's what a driver is.
Or the Cinebench scores come back at like 100,000. And then actually, the final item in our AMD review kit here today is a copy of some RAM. Is some RAM. This is a 32GB kit from G.Skill Trident Z Neo RGB. But interestingly, this one is actually CL28, so very low latency. Oh, look. Is that white? I thought it was going to be silver. This doesn't really go with my theme. What have you done to me? No, that doesn't look quite right, does it? I'm almost tempted to use other RAM because that really doesn't look good, does it? I believe this one is C30. Ah, there you are, that's better. Corsair Vengeance to the rescue. But with our board complete, I think it is now time to move on. Sound like Austin Powers again then. Just want to get things moving. Well, I do, to be fair, because I want to talk about our chassis. And this is actually the Lancool 207. And I was really intrigued when I first saw this at Computex earlier today, because this isn't even a particularly expensive chassis, around about £80 or dollars or so. Build quality is pretty good. It's clearly not as good as like the more expensive cases, but is not far off. This does not feel like a cheap chassis at all. But the main difference really with this, one of the ways they actually cut costs is to make the glass smaller, not thinner, like that, that's good. But one of the main differences with this is actually that this is a micro ATX case in size, but it's one that can accommodate full-size ATX boards, which I really like because most people don't need an ATX chassis, but obviously most boards are ATX, so you don't always have the option. So I like the fact that Lee and Lee are kind of thinking a little bit, well, I guess inside the box. Oh, and I see how they've done that. They've actually moved the power supply, because look, it doesn't go down the bottom anymore. You've actually got a couple of fans here that will give you better ventilation for your GPU, and then this bit is a little bit thinner, but then your power supply, I believe, goes here. So you can't fit like 360 rads or anything at the front, but bear in mind most people want to use the top anyway, and you've still got 140 fans on the front, so loads of ventilation. This really could be the best of both worlds. But anyway, moving around the back, we can see it's a little bit more basic here. I'd definitely like there to be more stuff, I suppose. But you do have a little channel here at the top. It doesn't look like you've got any hubs for ARGB, and my main worry is actually that this is quite thin. There's not really that much gap between, well, this plate here and then the side panel, which is fine if you're only routing your cables through this chamber, but most of us don't, and if you are going to be using like a separate hub or something for your fans, then obviously this could potentially cause an issue. Oh, and because I always forget to do this, here's the top of the chassis. It's mesh, and you do have two USB 3s and then one USB 3. But actually, let's get this facing down on the desk. I should just be able to drop this into position. All of our case cables look to be pretty standard, to be honest with you. You've got USB-C, USB 3, couple of fan headers, your front panel, then you've got HD audio, and then addressable RGB. But of course, now comes the bit that I've been dreading, not only because it's
a radiator,
but because this is a smaller chassis, and large radiators and small cases are usually difficult. So let's move our 4090 and power supply for a second and actually see what we're dealing with. And I think this one is actually reviewed quite well. We've done a couple of pre-rolls with this on the channel. We have the IQ Link Titan 360 RX. So these use the RX fans. They're very good in terms of performance. I don't think they're the absolute best looking fans, but they're pretty decent really. I'm being very nitpicky. But Corsair seems to have got the memo and actually pre-installed the fans, which makes my life a whole lot easier. And they have also completely redesigned the pump as well. So this should hopefully be better performing and also potentially a little bit quieter. I guess it depends on the settings and things that you're going to use. It doesn't look like there's any rails or anything, just comes off completely toollessly, and then yeah, the old-fashioned way of just screwing it into the top of the chassis. And it is slightly offset as well. I think you're going to have a much better time if you use 240 or a 360 over a 280. And you can still actually access all of your ports, which is nice. But having said that, I will still make my life easier by plugging our power cables in now. So the power supply that we're using, I'd probably go for 1000 watt with this one, to be honest with you, but 850 is going to be fine. The reason I say that is because if you did want to upgrade to something like a 5090 in the future, which you probably do if you are building this sort of gaming PC, then this might actually be cutting it a bit fine / not work. Obviously it depends what the 5090 is going to be, but that's the benefit of going for a power supply with a little bit of headroom. Obviously gives you some headroom. But let's find our CPU cable. We'll get these connected now, and then the whole thing should line up and then screw into position. Then I'm going to remove the default AM5 mount, carefully remove our Intel pump bracket. Then I can replace that with the AMD one. to just line up, screw down. And of course, because this uses Corsair IQ Link, getting this cabled should be pretty easy. And actually, if you did want to add or swap out any of the other fans, granted they are expensive, but if you did want to add any extra RX fans, it would be very straightforward. You just kind of daisy chain them together, make sure they're connected to the hub, rather than have to have all these addressable RGB cables flailing around. But as we have some decent ones on the front of the case, I'm okay with this. But you might not be. But it really should just be a case of plugging this into the hub, adding your micro USB. Micro USB. Ugh. Then you can add your 6-pin PCIe power, and then you do also have a little, I was going to say header again. It's a cable that goes to your fan header. And kind of as expected, to be honest with you, it is now starting to get a bit messy because actually between the cooler and the case, they're almost like kind of clashing a little bit because the Corsair cables, whilst I think they're a little bit longer now, still means that I couldn't actually route this cable through this bit here, which means that I've kind of got to have like this bulk of cables down the bottom, and the whole point is to try and get rid of stuff. But because we're using PCIe, I've got to use this really long cable, and you can see this is just not as clean as the Lee system that have you seen that video? Yes, it would have gone live last week. If you look at the Lee system that's now completely wireless, you only have like these tiny little fan cables, and then all of this essentially is gone from your system. I like that a lot, but anyway, we should be able to make it work. So we'll grab our power supply. So there's a couple of screws here. This then comes off, and then our power supply will fill this little gap. So I think it pushes through from this side, which really isn't very easy because you have a load of cables that are already here. Not the end of the world. That sits in there like that. Well, everyone, fast forward about another 5-10 minutes, and this is what we're left with. And I hate to say it, I really do, but I don't think I like this case. I get, again, what they've tried to do, but look at that. All of these cables need to be plugged in with this particular board to get it to work. There's actually another 8-pin as well underneath the ATX here that I've connected, so that will give you better PCIe support. Basically, it powers the full thing. This is me trying to be neat as well, but all of the cables have to kind of go here. This is the only place you have for them, and so many of them don't want to go this way, and I just don't think it's able to handle it very well. I mean, you've got this whole bulk here that all needs to be cable managed in this one single place. It just doesn't really work. It's not very natural. I mean, look at these cables here as well, right? That you would think this would go up here and down, but they're not long enough. You could blame Be Quiet for that, but personally speaking, I don't really think it is their fault. Even if you had a little bit more length, it probably still wouldn't work. There's no tie down points here either, so if you want to get this nice and neat, you can't. And I think I'm really going to struggle to get this side panel on, even if I can tidy this up. But this is the point. It's not whether I want to tidy it up. I'm forced to, and it's going to be very, very difficult to do it because we have the limitations with the case itself, which is, I think, a bit disappointing. But otherwise, we are pretty much ready to rock and roll. It is just one more... Where's my screwdriver? One more component left to go, and obviously, normally that would be the most exciting part, and that'd be the graphics card. But today, the CPU takes priority, because there have been so many leaks and rumors and things about this. I've just been itching to get this in a system and actually see if it is any good, and I suppose whether it does offer decent value for money, because with Intel not really offering anything particularly comparable, obviously it does mean that AMD can kind of charge what they want, and there will obviously be new graphics cards coming. So whether you want to recreate this now is entirely your prerogative. But if it was me, and I already had a PC that I didn't need to necessarily upgrade, if you're buying a PC from scratch right now, that's a different story. And if you are upgrading your PC now, I wouldn't really want to go for a 4090. But let's finish off the last piece of the puzzle, shall we, with our 600 watt power cable. We'll whack that side piece on top, and then... And I mean, the other thing as well is that this is a 600 watt ATX 3.1 cable. The last thing you want to be doing is like overly bending this. And at the moment, you are going to have to bend that in order to get it to fit in. So I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, I'm going to call it. Don't like this case. I'd probably go for something else. Let's grab ourselves a 4K monitor, shall we? 4K 180Hz. If you do want to see the full review of this, or just check out current pricing, links to everything, I'll link down below. This is very much the moment of truth. The fastest gaming PC you can build. Is it going to work? Sounds good. Sounds promising. They've not got that horrible noise from the bottom fans, which is good. New CPU installed. Yes. And I tell you what, actually, that motherboard is pretty wild, isn't it, with that display? I really like that. I mean, it's definitely overkill, but it looks good. And to be fair, to the case's credit, it definitely is a good-looking chassis. I think everything works quite nicely, and all we've done is add a 360 rad. It's not like we've done anything crazy. We've not swapped out any of the extra fans or anything. We've got Expo 1, Expo 2, Expo Tweaks, and my personal favourite, Expo on the Fly. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, through the power of editing, I think we can proceed to jump into some games. And we're not going to waste any time here. Let's start with the one that probably counts more than anything else, some Call of Duty Warzone. And of course, there are going to be a lot of numbers to pay attention to throughout this video, but the most important one is the one that currently says 98 under GPU 2, because that is the utilization of the graphics card. And of course, a CPU isn't actually that interesting if it's not doing anything. And the problem that you're going to have in Call of Duty Warzone with a lot of CPUs and then something like an RTX 4090 is that you are going to run into what we call CPU bottlenecking. So if you're not seeing this at all, then you can upgrade your CPU to, well, to the end of the earth, and it's not going to make any difference. But in a title like this, where it is actually going to potentially be a problem, then what we don't want to see from a brand new world's fastest gaming chip is for that number to start dropping down, because that shows that we still have some CPU bottlenecking. But right now, playing this at 4K, extreme preset, FOV 90 with DLSS set to quality, the good news is that doesn't seem to actually be changing. But what we're going to do in just a second is turn this down to 1440p and really start to see if we can get some bottlenecking. But if you're going to be playing this at 4K, this is actually a 180Hz monitor, then you'll probably agree this is going to be a pretty fantastic experience now, isn't it? But as I say, let's make this a little bit more interesting, shall we, and turn the resolution down to Quad HD. Because at the end of the day, this is how people are actually going to be playing the game, and now our overlay has got massive, but at least you can see it. And yes, I'm afraid to say, for better or worse, there is still more performance you could get if you upgraded this to a 10700 or 10800X3D, because we are still getting a little bit of bottlenecking. Now, clearly, it's not always going to affect you, because at the moment, we are now hovering again at around about 98, but you can see it does drop down in certain situations. But the good news is actually that we're getting a pretty sky-high frame rate of around about 240 FPS. So whether you actually need any more, well, probably not. But right now, look, 91, 92% GPU utilization. That means even if we swap this out for an RTX 5090, in theory, our frame rate would essentially stay the same. And because I know a lot of you will complain if we keep this at the extreme preset, let's turn this down to basic. And has that actually made much difference? Well, no. As you would expect, it's not really changed anything too dramatically, really. The frame rate remains about the same. And in fact, our GPU utilization, as expected, has now gone down to around about the 70–80% mark, because as I say, as you turn up the graphics settings, that tends to be a lot more demanding on the graphics card rather than the CPU. But of course, despite everything Gareth the spare cameraman tells me, the world does not revolve around Warzone. There are other titles out there, so how about we chase that raw FPS? And this is probably the game to do it. This is some Valorant, a game I much prefer over CS, but probably aren't really that much better at. And interestingly, we're actually running this at the moment at 4K, but we have the settings turned up to high. And as you can clearly see, our frame rate is around about 750, getting on for 800 FPS. Almost 800 FPS at 4K. But as I say, the whole point of this was probably to push this as far as it will go. So let's now turn this down to 1080p. Does that make any difference? It's actually lowered the FPS for some strange reason. I mean, clearly we are bottlenecked here by the CPU. But I've never seen that before. How about that, guys? If you want the highest frame rate possible, you got to be playing at 4K. That really is so weird, isn't it? I've just put it back up to 4K and the frame rate's gone up again. What is that all about? But ladies and gentlemen, I'm really sorry, this is Future Marcus here, interjecting our flow to lift the veil on some new gameplay, because this, of course, is Dragon Age Veilgard, and I've been playing this over the weekend, so I've progressed, this is about 7 hours or so into the game, no spoilers or anything, don't worry. But I've been really enjoying it, actually, and it's running really well on PC. I was getting very similar frame rates on my 4090 7800X3D system. Like, it's not crazy different, but this game is actually pretty demanding on the CPU. We've got this set to run at 4K, and we're actually running this with DLSS set to performance, and this is the way I've been playing on my very large 70-inch TV, and it looks fantastic. You can use DLSS frame generation, but I found it was a little bit buggy for me, so I would advise turning this off, but you've got loads of performance on offer anyway. You shouldn't actually have to use it. Now this is running at the Ultra preset, but I've actually set this to custom. There are a few other settings you can upgrade, one including this one called Ultra Ray Tracing, and then by default Ray Tracing, I've not actually seen this before, but I quite like it. By default it's set to this selective mode, so it only comes on in areas it thinks that it's going to be useful, but I've got mine set to on all of the time. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's night and day. The water reflections in this seem to be pretty non-existent, so you've still got some of the old school effects, but then this means that it does run really well. I mean, 120 FPS, 4K, DLSS, even without frame gen, it's all the frame rate you need. No one is going to need more than this. Even if it was running at 80 FPS, I'd still say it would obviously look and feel fantastic. So yeah, I've been very happy with this actually, and we will be doing some more Veilgard testing in the coming weeks. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, if you play Warzone, you play a lot of Valorant, then I'm sorry, but you're just
Wrong.
because the game you should be playing is this, some Fortnite. And obviously I jest, but I do seriously play this game. I really like it. It's definitely worth a go if you try the no build modes. I'm not really a fan of the others, but this is quite a good test actually, because obviously a lot of people play this, and it is, oh, don't know what happened there. And it is one of those titles as well that is quite demanding again on the CPU, especially if you do kind of want to run this with like a high-end graphics card and a high refresh rate monitor. Well, running this at 4K with DLSS set to performance, which is the way I personally play it at the moment, then we're actually getting a frame rate of around about 180 to 200 FPS. But again, if you look at our GPU utilization, you can see that we're running at about 97%. So we're not going to be bottlenecked at 4K, at least in this particular reload mode. But now lowering down the resolution to 1440p and changing the DLSS to, oh, that was a good kill actually, to balanced, obviously does yield an even higher frame rate. We're now looking at 200 to 220 FPS or so, but our utilization is still actually maintaining around about 96% or something, which is pretty good. And it goes to show that even if you are going to be playing at 1440p, then the CPU is able to hold up. Obviously, again, it depends on the settings and things that you're going to be using. This is a mixture of epic and high. I've tried to kind of, again, recreate what I would have on my personal system downstairs. Oh, you placed 9. But I do also want to turn this down to 1080. And yes, obviously this now looks completely ridiculous with the font size, but our frame rate has increased slightly, but not crazy. Interestingly, our GPU though is still pegged at around about 96%. So I'm wondering whether there's something with Fortnite that maybe is limited with something else. Maybe changing the RAM or something would help. But this number alone does show that the 4090 is bottlenecking our system, at least in theory. This is some Hogwarts Legacy. It's a game that I never really got into, to be honest. I'm sure I could do, but it's definitely been very popular with a lot of people. But this is one of the titles that's great for CPU testing because it is so demanding, especially in Hogsmeade. And if you look at the top left-hand corner of your screen, you can see that even with DLSS performance, 4K, we do have ray tracing enabled, but the game is at max quality, but we're leaving so much extra performance on the table. Again, if you upgrade to a 5090, it's not going to make any particular difference unless you use frame gen, because our frame rate is kind of stuck around about the 80 to 90 FPS mark or so, which is really quite interesting actually, because as soon as you turn frame gen on, you do get a much better result, but that does skew the figure at the top left-hand corner of your screen. But it's definitely running very well, there's no doubt about that, but you are going to be frustrated that you're still obviously leaving quite a lot of performance on the table, really. I mean, even the great 9800X3D cannot do everything, and there are definitely going to be games that you'll still run into an issue. So I would love to see a chip that comes out that's like 50% faster and completely solves these problems, but today is sadly not that day. A few other things to note. Firstly, in terms of thermals and things, well, pretty good really across the board. 51 degrees, the highest I've seen is about 54, at least in Hogwarts Legacy anyway. Noise levels, basically silent. The main thing is, whatever you get, make sure you tune it. In its default state, this cooler is pretty loud because it runs at full speed. As soon as you've got IQ enabled, the quiet mode, everything works quite well. It goes off coolant temp. Nothing to worry about, really. In terms of clock speeds as well, all cores are running, I think, at 5.2 gigahertz. Yeah, 5.2 gigahertz across all cores, and obviously if you did want to overclock that, you can do it yourself, or you can try one of these turbo modes that should work quite well. Only other thing to note is current pricing. This has now been released, $480 for the CPU, which I think is perfectly reasonable, to be honest. That's basically inflation. You know, there's not really that much competition for this particular chip. I mean, Intel are way off, and whilst you can get other options that have more cores, well, most gamers don't need extra cores, so most people that are buying specifically a gaming CPU are going to be looking at one of these X3Ds, and I think they're going to be really pleased. But obviously this does not live in an isolation chamber. There are other chips available, so how will this stack up? Is this the absolute best of the best, and is it the best by a big factor. Let's jump into the numbers with the one, the only, Bench Carl.
Hello everyone, it's me, Bench Carl, and AMD can once again claim the crown of having the fastest gaming CPU. I mean, they already had it with the 7800X3D, but the crazy new 9000 series chip is, well, are you ready for it? Just a little bit faster than the 7000 chip. That's right. Just like we saw with the battle between the other 9000 and 7000 chips, the 9800X3D is slightly quicker than the 7800X3D when it comes to gaming. Now, when it comes to the games we tested, it's a real-world mix of GPU-intensive and CPU-intensive titles, and we generally test with very high or ultra presets to reflect real-world use and help you balance your component choices. As you saw from Warzone and Hogwarts with Marcus, CPU bottlenecks are real, especially at lower resolutions, but the way our test came out today, it shows that a lot of games are still mostly GPU bound. We're sure there will be other channels that show you 1080p low numbers, so if you want to see those too, we encourage you to do so and check out the other videos. But let's show you how it affects a 4090 gaming rig. Now at 4K and 1440p with higher settings, you're a lot more likely to be GPU bound, though in Planet Zoo for example, the X3D chips are the best option regardless of resolution. However, on average at 1440p, it's still pretty close between the 14th gen i7 and i9 CPUs, though 1% lows are quite a bit higher for the X3D parts. But as we move on to 1080p and we reduce that load on the GPU, you can start to see slightly larger gaps emerge between the CPUs. Especially the more entry-level options, they really start to fall away at 1080p, but you wouldn't be pairing those with the 4090 of course. At 1080p, there are some respectable wins for the 9800X3D over the 7800X3D, in Counter-Strike 2 and Cyberpunk 2077, but in the other 4 titles, there wasn't much to be gained. And this is the type of thing you should expect if you're looking at playing with a high-end GPU and higher quality settings. But unless you are a true esports gamer, you probably won't be playing at low or medium settings. One thing I was impressed with was how much of an increase we saw in Cinebench versus the 7800X3D, and even the 9700X. The 7800X3D was slower than the 7700 in multi-core and single-core tests, but the new 9800X3D is faster than all of the other Ryzen 7 CPUs we've tested. Of course, it's still a long way off the Intel equivalents and the Ryzen 9 series chips in multi-core workloads, but it's a big improvement over last gen and makes the X3D chip more viable for work as well as play. When it comes to power consumption though, we saw good improvements from Intel and their Core Ultra range of chips, which was welcome. However, the 9800X3D used around 11.7 watts more power than the 7800X3D in the same test. Now 11.7 watts isn't much, but that's a 24% increase in power consumption. 57.7 watts for the fastest gaming CPU is still amazing, just less amazing than the 7800X3D was. Now there is one more thing that board vendors are releasing for all AM5 chips, and that's called Turbo Game Mode, which disables the second CCD on high core count chips and disables SMT. This can enhance performance in some games and hurt performance in others. We tested both 8-core X3D chips in Turbo Game Mode and saw mixed results. We saw an increase in FPS in Counter-Strike and, well, less performance in the other 4 games, with Cyberpunk remaining the same. If this was a quick toggle in some software, I think it's worth playing around with, but going into the BIOS, resetting your PC each time, and turning it off and on depending on the game you want to play seems like a bit of a pain, but it could work better for upcoming high core count H3D chips. Now when it comes to value, I suppose that's a little bit less important when you're buying the best of the best. The RTX 4090 is terrible value, but it's the best GPU right now. If I was building a new system today looking to pair it with a high-end RTX 5080 or 5090 in the future, I would buy a 9800X3D, not because it's the best value, but because it's the best CPU for gaming, and that's a win for AMD. But the gains aren't great, at least in the games we tested today. And don't forget, if history has taught us anything, prices on the 9800X3D will likely come down as time goes on. I personally bought a 7800X3D CPU in August 2023 for £329. It launched at £439 in the UK. That CPU now costs £397, as apparent stock issues have caused price increases. But I'm a glass half empty kind of guy, so in my personal opinion, I feel like the price has been raised over the last month or two to make the difference between 7800X3D and 9800X3D seem a bit more impressive for the 9000 series chip on launch. If you were hoping for the 9800X3D to be the savior of the 9000 series, then you'll be disappointed. But in particular CPU-bound titles with lower quality or more competitive settings, the 9800X3D is the fastest gaming CPU you can buy right now. But by such a small margin on average, we are a bit disappointed. But hey, at least it's not Intel Core Ultra, Back to you, Marcus.
So there we are then, folks. Definitely a very interesting set of numbers, and it's difficult for me because I think this chip is either going to be absolutely amazing, the best thing since sliced bread, or not really any different to what you've seen before, purely dependent on the games that you play. And there clearly is quite a big difference. And I guess if I was to be glass half empty, it would be to say, well, if you're going to be buying like an RTX 4090, 5090, then because you're going to be playing at 1440p, 4K, turning all of the settings on, maybe even using ray tracing, then actually the benefits you're going to get from this CPU, they don't necessarily make it worth buying, especially at the asking price when we know it probably will come down over time. However, on the other side of things, well, if you're just playing games that are affected by CPU speed and you are going to be maxing out your GPU, then obviously you are going to see big benefits. And I think this is why the data that I saw from AMD and obviously what we saw in the bits I tested, so like multiplayer games like Warzone for instance, when you are going to see like a noticeable improvement, didn't quite match up to the graphs that we saw with Carl. So maybe we could have tested better games, but what does that actually mean? Because surely if we only tested CPU dependent games, then that also wouldn't be very reflective. So we're kind of in two minds about it. We'll probably change the games we'll test next time just to add a couple more, maybe take a few things out. It's perhaps more complicated than you thought, and maybe buying the best CPU you can is going to make sense, especially if you have the best graphics card. But again, please remember, if you are going to be buying something like a 4060, 4070, then obviously because the margins are so tight on what graphics cards you can afford, paying an extra £100 or $150 or so for a more expensive CPU isn't necessarily going to give you a better frame rate when that money should go towards a better GPU. But anyway, that has been this video. I really hope it has been useful and that it's actually been different to what everyone else has got, so you can see the full picture. We'd love to hear from you, so let us know down in the comment section below. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this, get yourself subscribed, and of course, if you do want to check out current pricing on anything that was featured in this video, you can find it listed down below with our affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not check out the awesome new MSI Core Liquid i series. These incredible all-in-ones come in both 240 and 360 flavors, in black or white, and look simply divine. Not only are they super quick and easy to install, but thanks to the dual chamber pump design, enhanced copper base, larger microchannel and LDB fan bearings, you can pair this with a beastly CPU and still get awesome cooling and acoustics. Learn more about this gorgeous new cooler today with a link down below. But thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.